Hello and welcome back to the Showing Up to Life podcast and YouTube channel. My name is Art Burns and I'm still dealing with a little congestion in my post-COVID existence, but I'm feeling very well and I hope you are too. More importantly than I hope that you're feeling well, I hope that you're able to perform some resilience if you're not feeling well, right? Because resilience is always the answer. The answer is never about living a life without difficulty or living a life without reaction to what might be difficult in our lives, right? This is what our bodies are always doing 100% of the time. Our bodies, our nervous system, our mind, our emotions, they are responding to our experience. And so it's never about changing. Well, the only way that we could live free from any kind of reactivity would be to not experience anything. And I think you can see already that that is not possible, right? And so today I wanted to focus, though, on this concept when it comes to relationships or as it applies to relationships, right? Because a lot of times when I talk to people, and I talk to a lot of people all the time, right? I work with people who, mindfully working as a couple, right? Or I work with individuals who are, managing and navigating difficulties in their relationships. It happens. It's all over the place. It's all the time. And it happens in my life too, right? But the idea here is that when I'm talking to people, and even in my own experience, it's often the idea comes through that a healthy relationship is a relationship without conflict. Okay, now when I say a relationship or a healthy relationship, whatever, I'm not talking about only one certain kind of relationship, right? This applies whether you want to talk about a marriage or romantic relationship, you want to talk about a collegial relationship in terms of co-working or schoolmates or something like that, or even a friendship, or even most specifically, or very importantly, I should say, not most specifically, but very importantly, parental and child, a parent-child relationship, right? That these aspects or these relationships, the concept is that, and I'm sorry, I know I got a little distracted here. The concept is that, and anyway, the concept that I often hear expressed is that a healthy relationship is a relationship without conflict. Okay. There's two issues with that. Okay. Number one, it's an impossible standard, right? We all know that. I mean, you've had enough relationships in your life. Even a 10-year-old kid knows that even their best friend and them sometimes get into arguments, right? And so it's any relationship that we might be in. And again, this applies everything to, even a relationship that you might have with somebody at a store, right? Of just being a customer and walking up to the counter. That is a relationship, right? And there are always going to be conflicts that arise in all these relationships. And that is just purely because of what I said a moment ago, which is that we are all just responding to our experience. Right. And so what that means is that when you walk into a store and the person behind the counter, of course, that's a kind of anonymous relationship. So let's not use that as an example. Let's use instead a relationship with a spouse or a friend or a loved one. Right. We come into that relationship as our nervous system, as our mind, as our awareness, as our interaction. Right. And again, depending on what we're going through, maybe it was a difficult day. Maybe you got stuck in traffic on your way home, and your body's really hungry because you didn't get to eat lunch, and you're maybe you're even struggling with some emotional issue that's just been alive for you. Well, then that is all that you bring into the relationship when you get home and you open that door and your family's there, right? And in our own experience, we often think that that's the beginning, middle, and end of it, right? It's just about how I'm feeling. And that fails to realize that each one of the people with whom you interact are also managing their experience, or managing their reaction to their experience, right? In other words, maybe your spouse is also having a difficult time today. Maybe your children had a difficult day at school. Maybe, maybe your children are hungry. They didn't get to eat lunch either, or it's been, maybe it's a little late for dinner and they're starting to get, cranky. The point that I'm making is that there's always going to be conflict, because there's always going to be this response to our experience. So there's no relationship that could ever be without any kind of conflict. And so that brings me to my second point, which is that if we spend our time idealizing this healthy relationship that has no conflict, well, then even unconsciously, what we're going to start doing is we're going to start avoiding conflict. And this, my friends, is a mistake, okay? Because remember, as we said in the first point, there's no relationship that doesn't have any kind of conflict, ever, right? Just doesn't exist. It can't exist. It shouldn't exist, okay? Because that would mean that one or the other person is not really being themselves. There's no way that you could possibly be in complete harmony 100% of the time. And so therefore, instead of striving for this perfect relationship that has no conflict to it, which means to avoid the conflict in the interest of this healthy relationship, what we're then doing is we're not practicing conflict resolution. And conflict resolution, just like any other thing in our lives, is a skill. And it's a skill that, yes, includes things like empathy and compassion and understanding, presence, resonance. All of this is included, and these are all things that we can practice on ourselves so that we can apply it to conflict resolution. But the most important point is, and yes, I mean, these things will help. If you can practice empathy, you can practice patience, you can practice acceptance. These things are all going to come from mindfulness practices and kindness and compassion practices. And yes, these will get you there, okay? But they're not the only way. So the first step that I suggest that you all kind of maybe consider is, instead of avoiding conflict, that we face conflict head on. And in the process of facing the conflict head on, in the process of turning towards that conflict as opposed to turning away from that conflict, what we do then is we practice. Right? We practice resolving conflict. Now, sometimes it's going to take a lot of practice to get good at it, right? And of course, every conflict is going to be different, right? There's conflicts that are going to arise from internal, implicit trauma response those are going to be very, very difficult conflicts to resolve. Right? The more dysregulated we are, the more work it's going to take, right? And that's why it's important also to be, forgiving of ourselves and to be patient with ourselves as we get into conflict resolution. But the point that I'm trying to make is that we can prioritize the energy of resolution, which is essentially the same thing on an individual level as resilience, right? Because we remember that it is never, ever, ever about living a life that is free from, from any kind of difficulty. The only way you can do that is to lock yourself into a room for the rest of your life. And even then, there's going to be, who's bringing your food, who's maintaining the heat and the cleanliness. These are all going to pose difficulties. And every time we experience a difficulty, our body is going to respond to that difficulty. And it's going to respond with stress and the difficult emotions. And so our work is not to avoid those difficulties, the conflicts within ourselves, but our work is to learn the skills and to practice the skills to be able to return back to where we want to be, which is, our sort of baseline of being calm and in a place of well-being and health, right? And again, a lot of times people look at their own individual lives that way. They think like, okay, I have to live a life that has no problems to it. And that's when I've got it all together, right? But as we've illustrated here, there's no such life. There is no such life because you're not in control of all of it, right? All you can control is you. You can't control what a person at a store says to you. You can't control what somebody on the road does, whether they cut you off or don't cut you off. You can't control, how your kids speak to you. You can't control how your spouse speaks to you because, again, depending on where these people are in their personal experience, which is to say where they are in their own nervous systems, that's going to drive how they interact with us. And so the key then is two very specific steps, right? Number one is to see what is actually happening. That's the first step. Always, 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 right? And to know that your perception is fallible. Right? And to know that your perception is fallible based on the fact that your perception is going to change depending on your own internal status, your brain chemistry, your body chemistry, your level of tiredness or energy, your level of, hunger or satiation. These are all going to impact how you process the world around you. And as you process it, how you respond to it. Okay. So the first step or a first step is to see things realistically, to see things as things are, knowing that you're not likely to see things the way they are without some kind of skill applied, right? That if left alone, you're going to see things the way you are. And that's really important to understand. Because again, if I'm hungry, let's just take something very basic as hunger, okay? That impacts the chemistry in my body. That chemistry in my body impacts the way that I feel, okay? Just as a physical sensation. Now, that physical sensation is going to influence my thoughts and my emotions. And so, therefore, when I'm feeling something like hunger, I might feel a little irritable, right? And then in that irritability, my mind and my thoughts are going to tell me that, you know what, you can't deal with this right now. You got to get out of here. This is terrible, right? Or they're going to perceive the way that somebody says something to me is going to be perceived as an insult where it was just a neutral statement, right? A few weeks ago, somebody was telling me a story about, it was a married couple who, one person got a text from somebody at work saying something about like, what kind of candy you're going to get me tomorrow, right? And the person's spouse looked at that and was like, what the heck is this? Rightfully so. Because that perception, and again, depending on how the person was feeling when they read that on the phone, right? If they're in a very happy place, they're going to be like, oh, is this a friend of yours at work? Right? But maybe they're not in a happy place. It turns out in that particular time that there was some other stuff kind of cooking. And so if that other stuff is cooking, well, then you're likely to perceive this potentially innocent thing as a grievous transgression in a marriage. And that's exactly how it was perceived. It was perceived with a lot of anger and a lot of resentment and a lot of alarm. Only to find out 15 minutes of fighting afterward that this person was like, she's like a 65-year-old woman in the office who was just being friendly. Like there was literally nothing of what the person thought was going on. Nothing. But in that moment, when we're experiencing that thing, we think the worst possible scenario. And again, this depends on how we're feeling when we experience this thing, this event in our lives, right? But again, if I'm feeling, again, just say I'm hungry. It could be something as simple as just being hungry. That when I perceive this thing and I experience this thing in this place of hunger, then I'm going to automatically see it as a threat because my body is already kind of in a defensive mode or a survival mode because it's hungry, right? And right now, the most important thing for my body is to get some food in it so that I can feel comfortable again. But if this thing pops up in this place, now it feels like conflict. It feels like emergency. It feels like danger. And in a very real sense, it is, right? Because now this thing is preventing me from just going to the refrigerator and getting something to eat, right? Now I have to, or I believe that I have to deal with this instead. That is also part of the delusion. The delusion, being that I have to somehow, immediately handle this thing. But that delusion comes from the idea that it is a problem in and of itself, right? Whereas instead, what I could do is I could take a deep breath. I can say that the best thing I can do right now is to regulate my body. And part of regulating my body is getting to the refrigerator and getting myself a banana or an apple or what have you, a spoonful of peanut butter, maybe, whatever it is. I need to get my body into a place of, regulation. Because otherwise, I'm going to perceive things in a way that is not true. This actually just happened to me this morning in a Facebook thing. Okay, so I just commented on something on Facebook that's part of one of these other groups that has like tens of thousands of people in the group, right? And so, so there's 30 people or something like that have responded to my comment. And the comment was just something about meditation, right? It was, the post was about, the post that I commented on was talking about how, maybe people who spend an hour a day of meditation are happier because they live a life that affords them an hour a day to meditate, right? And maybe it's not just the meditation, but their lifestyle. And I think that's a very valid point. And so the thing that I responded to was that actually you don't need an hour a day to sit and do nothing, right? And so a lot of people were like, yeah, that's true, blah, blah, blah. Not many comments, but just a lot of likes and hearts and, and that kind of stuff, right? And then so this morning, one person, I open up and I'm like, oh, somebody commented on my comment. Let me see what they say. And it was a person who was saying, first of all, he said BS, but he said out the word, right? He said, this is, he accused me of orientalizing and mysticizing and all these like very, he was, spitting the words. You could even read it in the text on Facebook. You could feel the resentment that he was feeling in there. So now I could have, right? I had that opportunity in that moment. I could have said, hey, watch who you're talking to and blah, 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 and given him back all that anger, right? Or I could have said, maybe we're not really understanding each other because I think I'm agreeing with you. Spoiler alert, that is what I did comment. And 5 minutes later, he wrote back. He said, this is amazing that I read it even 3 times just now, and I kept reading that you do need to stop doing everything in order to meditate, which was the actual opposite of what I was saying. But in that moment, what we did together was we resolved the conflict. But again, it was because, and I'm not saying this to toot my own horn or to kind of, oh, look how great I did today. That's not the point here. I'm just illustrating this for you. Okay, but the point is that because I was aware that maybe my perception might be off and maybe this person's perception might be off. Because I held that in my awareness, I was able then to approach this in a way, again, the energy being about the resolution of the conflict, not the defending myself or not the making sure that I'm understood, right? Instead, it became about how can I peacefully and with kindness and compassion, how can I change this? How can I resolve this conflict? And in the end, he wrote back again. He said something about like my fallible perception. I think he said I was pulled into the river by my own fallible perception, which is really beautiful that he was able and willing to stand with it and say, hey, I was wrong here. But one of the reasons why I was able to do that is because I created the space for that, right? If I had come back at him and said, hey, stop being so blah, 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 and blah, 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 well, then he would have needed to respond to that, right? And then it's just conflict, right? Who's going to win? But just like a war, nobody wins a fight. You both lose. It's just one person loses more painfully than the other. So it is when we can bring the energy of conflict resolution, again, that does two really important things. It holds the space for each of us to say, hey, this is what's really happening here. And to do that without embarrassment and without shame and without guilt and without, that pressure that we might put on ourselves because we effed up, right? To say, yeah, hey, I blew it. I screwed up. Look at me. I just cursed at you. That's what this guy did. He said, look at me. I just cursed at you because of my own misperception. But we laughed together about it. And actually, in the end, he said, much love to me. Like that was his sign off was that I love you, right? And this person who just cursed at me, right? And so all conflicts can be resolved. Every single one. Now, of course, there's a spectrum to this, right? I mean, of course, the conflict of somebody who, for me, I was the victim of a violent crime 20 years ago, 25 years ago now. Gosh, can't believe it's been that long. But, at the time I felt like I would never not be the victim of a violent crime. I don't identify that as anymore, right? But again, it took a long, long time for me to resolve that conflict within myself, right? That was difficult. I mean, somebody literally put a knife into me and beat me to the point where I was almost dead. I could have died on the side of Canal Street at 4:00 in the morning that night in 1997. That was really, really hard. A lot harder than the person who, honks at me, right? Because I'm not walking across the street fast enough or something like that, right? Or not nearly as hard as this person on Facebook who's an anonymous person who can't hurt me. It's just words, So it's not to say that all conflict is the same, but it is to say that all conflict resolution is the same process. It's just a question of how big that process is. And this is also an important time to recognize and to remember that it is also not a static, monolithic kind of action, right? Like this is how forgiveness works, right? And ultimately, forgiveness is very much part of any kind of conflict resolution because the first thing you have to do is forgive the person, who's causing you difficulty. And the first thing they have to do is forgive you. Otherwise, resolution becomes much more difficult, right? And so forgiveness is also not a monolithic static thing that happens, right? So again, the person who these obscenities, like I forgave that person immediately. It took no effort at all to forgive this person. It was just one breath, and I forgave them because I was convinced that even if I wasn't convinced that they misunderstood me, I recognize that this is just one person's, perception, and they are coming at this perception from a place of their own nervous system experience, right? So whatever they're yelling at me for, is something much more reflective of them than me. So this was like no time at all, literally like one breath, and they were forgiven, and they're going to stay forgiven forever. The person who stabbed me with a kitchen knife and tried to kill me, I don't think they tried to kill me, but they hit an artery, and I bled a lot, and I could have died. And so forgiving that person is not any different from forgiving the person on Facebook. The action of forgiveness is always the same. But it's a question of returning and continuing and reapplying, if you will. Okay, because that person who put a knife into me and their partner who beat the heck out of me, they don't stay forgiven after just one thing. Because it was a very, very difficult thing for my body and my nervous system to experience. It was traumatizing. And so in that trauma, first I have to resolve the post-traumatic stress disorder that comes from that. And then I can be in a position to even, apply the first layer of forgiveness. And forgiveness is something I like to look at as I was teaching a workshop on forgiveness a few weeks ago, and I used the example of painting a wall inside a home. Right? You take the roller, you put the paint on, and that first coat, it looks beautiful. It's like, oh, it looks so even. It's nice. It's beautiful. All right, let me go get something to drink. I come back 5 minutes later, and now it looks very splotchy because it's dried unevenly. Right? And that's the way paint dries. And there's nothing, the paint didn't do anything wrong, right? The paint did what the paint does. And so I could stand there and say, oh man, I thought it was perfect. Darn it, it's not perfect. Now I got to live with this imperfect wall for the rest of my life. And this is always going to make me feel horrible every time I look at it. And if I did that, anybody around me would be like, ooh, boy, I think Art needs some help here. I mean, he could just roll another layer of paint on the wall, right? And that's what it is. It's just returning to it. It's just coming back and saying, hey, we had this fight and I want to resolve it. How can we resolve this? No, get out of here. I'm not blah, 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 blah. Okay. Come back the next day. Hey, I would really like to resolve. No, I'm still angry. Okay. Come back the next day. Hey, can we resolve this? Well, only if you, okay, let's talk about that. Are you sure you understood what I meant by that? Am I sure that I understood what you meant by this? Can we talk about it? And then in the end, most of the time, what we realize is that there was some kind of delusion there. There was some kind of misunderstanding. There was one person reacting to something that was not accurate. And that's the process. Now, again, sometimes that's a one and done, right? Sometimes it's just like, oh, I didn't mean that. I meant this. Oh, that changes everything. I love you. Okay. Just like this guy on Facebook today. Other times, it might literally take weeks to get to that point. But remember that the important thing is that every time you try, every time you apply that coat of paint to the wall, you get better at it. You become more skillful. And so it's important to recognize that conflict resolution is a practice that is building a skill. And the more you do it, the better you get at resolving conflicts of all sizes and shapes. All right, folks, I hope you enjoyed this today. I feel like this was a little bit of a wide ranging, just checking the time. Oh, man, just 30 minutes. I'm pretty impressed with that. Like literally just 30 minutes as I said that to the second. Well, it was like 59 seconds at that point. But anyway, I feel like this is a little bit of a wide ranging podcast today. I hope you all followed me. And yeah, and thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I was about to ask a question, but I've come to realize that most people don't make it to the very end of this. So if you're here listening to this, I want you to know that you're awesome. All right, thank you. And I'll be back tomorrow, and I'll ask my question tomorrow in the beginning of tomorrow's podcast. All right, everybody. Hope you have a great day. I wish you well. And more than I hope that you have a good day, I hope that you're able to return to your well-being no matter what the day presents to you. All right. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourself.